The second complication, and please stop me if like I'm getting too in the weeds too soon. Um, the second complication that the article discusses involves um, multiplicity versus identity. So we ask the question, when a new man-made structure comes into being, is it in all cases the manifestation of some pre-existent unified principle, right? Like, is there some kind of heavenly prototype for something like Instagram? In the article, we use the example of the New York Stock Exchange. Um, but or is it better to say that this new entity is in some way a combination of pre-existent principles, right? So, and if that's the case, are higher beings sort of like assembling in the spiritual domain to bring these structures into manifestation? Because if so, we have a kind of like emergence in the spiritual domain, and that's the very thing that we're kind of trying to get rid of in the material, right? Um, and I think all of us here are probably equally committed to a view that sees both emergence and emanation as kind of like a package deal, right? In all cases. So in the article, we kind of implicitly suggest uh, the answer that with man-made structures, all have a kind of logos which is expressed in the structure like to varying degrees, right? So in structures where there's a high degree of logos tropos mismatch, right, where like the idea of the structure is off from the way it's actually manifesting, then we have a kind of ascribed identity. Um, so we point to Instagram, we point to the New York Stock Exchange, and we give it a name. But we're suggesting that like whatever divine principle might be at its core, right? How God intended that thing to come into being is being hidden from us to a degree and kind of replaced by a sort of mixture or confusion of angelic and demonic principles. And
Hmm.
that kind of brings us to our headless designation, right? So we're saying that okay, maybe an appropriate way to use the word egregore is for these like giant collective structures that human beings participate in, but whose um, ontological grounding, as it were, is questionable, right? So it's like whatever angel might be sort of ontologically at the head is being relegated to the background, and it's being kind of replaced by a sort of confusion.
Yeah. All right. So I really, first of all, I really appreciate the criticism because it really forced me to think about it a little more and to clarify some things. And you'll see when we put out the discussion with John and Jordan that's coming out soon, we talk about three types of beings, you could say. That is, there's a being, one would be a regular being that is, let's say, a being that is aligned with the will of God. Let's call it that way. Like, so a being that exists in higher being. So a being that exists in higher loves. So you have, you're living inside a family, you honor your parents, you honor the king, you also, worship Christ. Everything is aligned and you accept that you exist in these higher principalities. And so you're kind of aligned in a way that makes everything fit together. So, you have this image going both ways. You see that in a lot of Taoist statements, but would you find them in a lot of Eastern statements? The idea that like if the king is well in his heart, then the kingdom will do well. And there's this like sense of like if you're well in your heart, then your family will do well, then the city will do well, then the kingdom will do well. And so there's this alignment. And so there's that. Then there's what we could call parasitic beings. And so parasitic beings are those that exist in pride for themselves. And so what they do is they actually threaten their higher participation. So we talked about addictions. We talked about, the idea of someone in a bureaucracy that is acting only for their own interest, and therefore they're taking the resources of that being, using it just for their own interest, and without, and so their actions are actually threatening the world in which they live. Like they're because they're acting only for their own self-interest. And then you would have something which would look more like more chaotic headless beings that you talked about, which are like these loose associations that don't seem to have a real telos, or they have approximations of telos. And so so it really helped us to kind of talk about these a bit different. But with you guys, what I didn't say in that conversation, which is what I'll say in this, is that to me that seems to fit the Christian ontology perfectly. So Saint Gregory of Nyssa, in Life of Moses, he has I won't quote it directly, I'll paraphrase it. He has a wonderful quote where he talks about how something about how, non-being is that which, the things that think they have their own being are non-being. And those that basically are rooted in God, then that, because the Christ is true being. And so for you to have true being, you must be rooted in the incarnation. That is what you have to be rooted in. And then true being kind of flows from that. And so there's a sense in which all beings that aren't aligned towards the incarnation, that aren't aligned towards the summit of the mountain, what they will appear as is either parasitical or headless, because that's what they are, right? Because they are trying to self-exist, then they become these parasitic, headless beings. And so the idea, for example, of wondering about demons that let's say manage certain aspects of reality, and when we look at it, it looks chaotic and messy. It's like, that's because it is chaotic and messy. Right? That's why demons are represented as chimera. That's why demons are represented as hybrids and mixtures of different categories, because that, in a way, that's what they are. And so the idea of egregore as something like that, then that seems to make sense. Something which doesn't seem to have its alignment properly. So because it doesn't have a proper alignment, it appears as something which is colonized by different intelligences, and so is struggling to. So think about it like when you don't know what to do. It's like, I don't know what to do. I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to do that. And so I'm paralyzed by all these. I'm being colonized by all these different possibilities, and so I can't act properly in the world. Let's say. Or then there's the parasitic one, which is that I get so obsessed with the lower good, a lower good that I am, that I spiral into this like weird, what is it that John Vervaeke calls it, reciprocal, like narrowing or whatever, something about reciprocal narrowing. Yeah, exactly, where you kind of narrow into these like smaller goods, and then it ends up devouring you. It ends up basically paralyzing you. So anyway, so that's what I kind of came out of your critiques. I don't know if that, at least that makes sense in terms of what you saw as the issue with these different ways of seeing.